Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Today, we are joined by Sandy Ikeda, Professor of Economics at Purchase College, SUNY. How are you doing today, Sandy?
Hi, Joe. Just fine, thank you.
Excellent. Fantastic. Well, the reason I invited you on is because if you spoke at one of our events, Startup Cities in New York, and you had some
Right.
really interesting ideas about the impact of cities on economic development. Can you first, just generally broad strokes, why are cities important to economic growth?
Well, if you look at where ideas are generated and where they spread from, not only today but historically, they tend to do that in large, dense settlements. And it's not to say that you don't have new ideas being created today in the suburbs and exurbs, but cities provide the connections, the wealth, and the sort of serendipity that are part and parcel of processes of innovation and artistic and business creativity.
So one of the things you mentioned with cities is because of there's so many people bumping into each other, there's such great density that there's a big need for trust in these cities in order to function properly. Can you really explain that a little bit further?
Sure. Yeah. In this, I was first inspired by Jane Jacobs reading Death and Life of. But there's a vast literature on the nature and significance of trust and how it develops and so on. It links actually to called social network theory today and other concepts such as social capital and things of that nature. And in cities that are particularly successful and in terms of generating ideas and creativity and innovation are full of strangers by necessity. In order to be exposed to new ideas, in order to diffuse those ideas effectively, you have to be able to form connections with people you don't know, or they can be long-term, they can be very, very brief. The case is when you're walking down the street in a city that's like 1 million people or more, most of the people you will encounter are complete strangers and you'll never see them again. And so it's important that you don't feel threatened by them, that you feel secure in public space. That's sort of the basic amount of. And then beyond that, if you're going to be engaged in buying and selling, even if it's just going to the store, buying something, or if you're going to set up a new business, you have to establish supply lines to your buyers, etc. There's to one degree or another trust. I mean, think about financial lending and borrowing. That can't survive without trust over time, or you're giving somebody something over time and you're trusting that they will reciprocate. So these things tend to happen in successful cities in all sorts of areas, finance, in business startups, in just using and consuming all the different things that you can find in cities. And so trust is what Jane Jacobs calls a bedrock attribute of cities.
So the interesting thing is that cities started a very long time ago, near the right after the hunter-gatherer period, but that wasn't a really high trust society at that time. How did they come together and have enough, for lack of a better word, trust capital in order to form these cities?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, Homo sapiens are at least, 300,000, 500,000 years old, and they've been living together in smaller groups for hundreds of thousands of years. And so I think the latest estimate of when human beings started to live together, not in large groups, but in sort of in tribal groups and to leave evidence in places like Europe, et cetera, is about 300,000 years. So the first real cities were formed about 8 or 10,000 years ago, right? So if you think about the vast amount of time from about 300,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago, what was happening during that time was not much. And so you had to be able to have a confluence of events. People needed to be able to encounter each other without fear and conflict. That just took a lot of time. I think in the history, prehistory of civilization, these elements might have come together many times and just never quite took off, or they may have gelled and then died. And so we finally get a situation where you can establish large settlements where hunter-gatherers are able to trade the things that they've foraged, the wild food and things that they've managed to gather in ways that, in proximity, in ways that are much more productive for them, that create much more value. And once that starts, they realize that the socially distant people that they encounter are not necessarily threatening. Then that sort of reinforces itself, and the physical manifestation are the large settlements that eventually do become cities.
So in order to reduce conflict and therefore increase trust, what role does governance play into that?
Well, governance is extremely important. I mean, you need to, I think what the initial impetus, nobody really knows for sure what the initial impetus for these settlements were. Sometimes, they may be religious, they may be military, but the very successful cities, the cities that grew were market-based cities. That is to say, they were cities that, there were settlements that were established to facilitate trade. And so once you do that, there have to be certain rules that everyone agrees to. What is an honest trade? What's fair play? What constitutes reciprocity? What are media of exchange? And so on and so forth. How do you establish quality and all of that? And that definitely requires rules. Everyone has to understand and those rules must be enforced. So having a governance structure, having a place where you can go to resolve disputes where they occur, because in cities, proto-cities and large settlements, you begin to encounter problems of property rights in a significant way. Not that you didn't have them before, but when you're living up against people that you don't know that well, then property rights become really important. And so how do you determine what is your property and so on, requires, adjudication, regards negotiation. And, in extreme cases, you need to have some sort of governance structure that imposes certain rules that and enforce those rules. So governance is extremely important.
Absolutely. And governance, in that sense, is between, adjudicating disputes among people in order to establish trust. But there's also the governance between people and the infrastructure, people in the physical city itself. What is the importance of urban planning in governance?
That it depends. I think, that's a big question. People have to be able to agree. For example, usually large settlements are established until very recently near waterways, near the sea coasts, on rivers and so forth. And so how you agree where, who can draw the water, and if you're near a forest, who can cut the wood and when, that is extremely important. And so, Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics several years ago, did a lot of work on looking at how communities were able to solve these kinds of problems, which are typically called common pool resource problems, in ways that are mostly voluntary, and they're able to come to, not always, but she tracked many cases historically all around the world where lasting agreements about the usage of common pool resources were made and had lasted for generations throughout history. So that sort of thing. And then, of course, transport, using the rivers and such, who has the right to do what, and building of roads and bridges and things require a great deal of cooperation, at least by some of the community. So yeah, infrastructure, governance, and the voluntary trade and such sort of come together and cooperate and complement one another.
So our readers are really interested in like specific examples about this these sort of things. What are some really good examples of transportation that exists currently that we can try to replicate or try to use as an example in the future?
That's a very good question. I don't really have a good answer for that because so much of what we see today is of different kinds of, both privately and by governments, and they kind of coexist in a sometimes a stable way, but oftentimes an unstable way. Take, for example, New York City, which at the beginning of the 19th century had no large-scale public transport. I mean, there were buses and things of that nature that were horse-drawn and animal-powered, and the beginning of cable cars and such. But the subways in New York City weren't established until 1904, and they were established by private companies, which were able to use existing streets to basically cut into and then put rails down and then cover them later. So there was no real problem of eminent domain going on, since the city itself controlled the streets. They weren't privately owned. So the first subways in New York were private, and there's a period in New York, basically the first third of the 20th century, where the density of New York was able to sustain private development, where it made it profitable for private companies to do this. And then as things change, in particular, the municipal government established its own subway system in competition, and among other things, underpriced the private companies. There was the problem of financial problems, but the private companies were having financial problems anyway, because that period where you could have the density, that could sustain this was relatively short. But the bottom line of that is that New York now has a pretty good subway system, which basically stopped expanding about the time the government took it over in the 1930s, early 1940s. And we haven't had a significant expansion of the subway system here in New York until very, very recently. The Second Avenue subway opened up, and a few years ago, the number 7 line extended out to the far west side. But other than that, now other cities have come later, which, where the municipal government and federal government and the national governments have had a great deal to do with it. But the problem with that kind of heavy infrastructural fixed rail kind of transport is that times change, and New York right now is suffering from trying to adjust to changing circumstances. We have subway cars, for example, that are still in use after 50 years. Our subway signaling system is half a century old as well. And so, the past solutions to, the problems of the past don't do well under current circumstances. So, the key here is for the rules that govern transport to be flexible enough for people to, entrepreneurs, to find alternatives, cheaper alternatives that currently exist. So that doesn't really answer your question to a solution.
Well, it answered a lot of other questions, so thank you for that. But I liked what you said about sort of the stasis of older cities, sort of like
Right.
the reverse leapfrog effect, meaning that older cities, it's harder for them to develop new infrastructure. Do you believe that new cities have a competitive edge over old cities in implementing smart city infrastructure, quote unquote?
There's certainly an advantage of using current technology and know-how, right? There's certainly an advantage to doing that. If you go the charter city route, for example, the Romer idea of charter cities, where you start with a blank slate. And of course, there's never a completely blank slate, but a place where there is currently no large settlement or city, then yeah, you can lay out whatever the current or futuristic vision of a city is. But you have to be careful because, planners have tried to do that. I mean, by planners, I mean planning association movement in the late 19th, early 20th century. The architect turned planners like Corbusier or Ebenezer Howard, had specific visions about what an ideal city should be. And in Ebenezer Howard's case, he said, well, you need to find a place where there's no development, and you can create these garden cities. And he had a whole conception of how not only they would be built, but how they would be financed and so forth. And there's a trade-off here, because on the one hand, yeah, you're using the latest technology and thinking, but of course that's going to change. And so the more specific, the more design detail, and the larger the scope of your plans, the less flexible they tend to be, the less complex and spontaneous the adjustments can be as the future becomes the present. And that another example, the example of the New York subway system is like that, where you're kind of frozen in time. And so you have to be careful about that. And some of that's unavoidable, right? You build a road, you build a subway, you build a bridge, it's going to be there for a while. But the invisible infrastructure, including sort of the rules, the laws, the regulations, need to be flexible enough so that you have flexible land use, so that a bridge that's no longer being used for one thing can be used for another, a building can be reused, a street can be cut up, or blocks can be redeveloped in different ways. The problem with that, of course, is that requires change at the micro level, at the level of the neighborhood and so forth, which people like the way things are. And when you change something, it's messy and it's smelly and it's noisy, and you lose stuff, right? You lose things that you liked, the store that you used to go to as a kid, and a particular building and streets and things. When they're successful or always changing and adapting, and when they're not, they tend to die. They tend to get sick and not be creative. They don't conduce to innovation and things of that nature. So there is this trade-off that we have to be aware of between scale and design, level of design, and the level of complexity and adjustment and spontaneity you want to allow.
So I just want to play devil's advocate really quickly, because there's also the other extreme, like Gorgon, which is a private city, which Sharp Society obviously is a fan of trying to promote. But while there's this lack of a central plan, they have all these plots, like these little areas and business zones, and they're not really connected at all. And they have these big problems with gaps in infrastructure. How do you think that private cities can avoid that problem?
Well, the problem of Gurgaon in India, well, my colleague Raj Palan Brock have written about that. It's certainly not an ideal private city, if that's what you want to call it. I mean, it is private in the sense that all the infrastructure anyway is private, but there are these negative externalities, the wastewater, the pollution externalities that exist in that city. The lack of a larger governance structure, a larger set of agreements among these private owners has led to and congestion, excessive congestion, and things of that nature that people would like to change but don't really have the means. So that is a problem. Now, what has recommended is might perhaps, I mean, the usual response is that, well, government, some sort of monopoly of authority, come in and rule by force. What she suggests is, well, you could go the opposite way too. Entire city could be private in the sense that people don't own an infrastructure. That has some sort of leasehold agreement, I guess, much like a cooperative you own shares in the city itself. Businesses and residents can own shares in cities and stuff, but they don't own space that they are using. And so what that does, think of a trailer park, think of a hotel, think of a cooperative in New York City. It internals externalities, because if it's privately owned, then the owner, who is motivated by profit, wants to make sure that people are, like any, satisfied with their product, the quality reasonably high, so the maximum profit from their endeavors. That is one that, if you're going to the city, you need to have some sort of way in which the individual can come to an agreement about the usage of these public spaces, and that could be rules of the private city, right? And there'd be some of the private city. It can't be changed. Goes institution is, but it should be flexible enough, at least at the lower levels, at the levels of rule making, how to change the rules, lower level of operating those. Really flexible can you be, right, to operate within those rules? There are possibilities of being very rigid or being more flexible. Establish a private, I think, aware of it. It's easy to see. How can I just think, you have to go slowly. You can't start off trying to imagine and construct what this city will look like, what it will be. You have to be able to set up the infrastructure that's flexible, and then sort of stand back and let what happens. And that means you may not like most of what happens, as the initiator. You may have wanted it to be more of one thing, but instead of being that, it's something else, and you're disappointed. It's full of disappointments, full of successes and joys, but it's also full of disappointments and sadness too, because things do change in this way. You enter new arrangements, you leave old ones, and there's this ongoing process, social process that happens. And if you're designing the infrastructure or the grid, so forth, of a city, you have to be aware of that. You have to, you have to accept that that's sort of thing is going to happen.
Cities are grown, not built, and sometimes you don't like the results. I 100% agree. Well, Sandy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
If you plant, an apple tree, it may not come up an apple tree, right? It may come out a grapefruit tree. So you just kind of have to go with that.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming on, Sandy. I really appreciate it. Thank you for everyone for listening, and join us for next time at the Startup Societies Foundation podcast.